So, welcome back finally for what is now the long overdue next instalment of the Audiobook Club series for this year. Now, I will note that Brutal Kunnin, which was my recommendation for last month, is a very enjoyable audiobook, and for myself, on a second listen, it was only better. And one of the reasons it's great to revisit narratives you've listened to before is that 40k narratives are often quite long, and so the first time around you really only get a flavour, and it's tough to really pick up everything going on over a 10 to 12 hour narrative. Plus, I often find that characters tend to grow on me after I've absorbed a new narrative, and I warm to characters that I hadn't at the time, as I ruminate on the story. And this was definitely the case with Brutal Kunnin, and its two lead characters are both enjoyable and memorable for me. I don't want to waffle on too long at the start, obviously. I need to mention though a little about why there was a delay in this series and also why the format for it is changing. Now, for those who don't know, about 2 years ago I damaged my vocal cords from doing live streams too often and speaking above my vocal range. This has left it very difficult for me to speak for extended periods, and that's another reason, guys, why this month there was a little break. Now, I thought this was going to be manageable going into this year to do like live stream series for the audiobooks, but as we got into February, the audiobook discussion, it became very clear that it was not going to be manageable for me, and I had to take a break to ensure that things didn't get any worse for my voice. So I've settled on doing these audiobook overviews in this new format going forward of here on the channel in videos. So first, I'm going to announce the choice of audiobook for the month as before, both when I do a video and also via my community tab on the channel, and I'll always make sure you guys have got plenty of time before the end of the month. And then after that month's choice, I'll overview the audiobook here in a video and discuss the elements that I thought were interesting, noteworthy. Now, you guys can also have your say either below the video in the comments, but as many of you saw last week, I will also be asking for your comment submissions ahead of time in the community tab section on the channel, and I'll feature some selected comments here on the video as well at the end. So the format remains largely the same, simply without the live stream. And in some ways, I think this is actually better, because I know for some people catching a live stream can be tricky depending on the time, and this way hopefully more people can enjoy, plus it enables me to theoretically be more concise. But as we all know, I'm far from the best at condensing my thoughts. And also the Valdor video that I did here on the channel where I was overviewing that audio story went down very well, so I think this format will work. Anyway, with all of that said, this month's choice was Brutal Kunnin, a tale of orky smashing and cog faces talking about stuff. And I will just say one last thing, if you've not listened to the audiobook Brutal Kunnin, very obviously spoilers from here on, although as per usual I am only discussing a bare bones overview here. For the full detailed experience, you really want to go and check out the audiobook, which you can do via my Audible link in the notes of this video, and that is just audible.com/LUETIN. So Brutal Kunnin is in essence more of a battle story than anything else. Within the style of narratives produced by Black Library, there are pretty much always going to be battles within the stories. In fact, there are many Space Marine tales specifically designated as the battle series, and this is not to say that one specific way of doing it is better than the other, it's just a subjective preference whether you enjoy more action or not. And sometimes for me, I find the very action-heavy tales can actually be somewhat grinding, because it's actually quite difficult, as you might imagine, to describe them at length. A battle without visually seeing it, it's quite a challenge for that to not become tedious. However, this can also help us to see when a story has been well structured, well paced, well written, when it contains a lot of battle and action, and where it doesn't become tedious and grinding and it really just flows. Now for myself, Brutal Kunnin sits into that category. It's paced very well, and despite the main theme essentially being Orcs smash planet, it does a great job of blending the unfolding narratives together. And those three narratives being, firstly, the core narrative of the Orcs. The Orcs begin basically by having a completely bonkers time in warp space, and they're apparently travelling aboard an Imperial ship which they had somehow captured. The Orc boffins, who are basically Orc science techs, have rigged a way to get the ship to crash into warp space. The result seems to have been a horrific time for the humans, who are described as having their flesh basically being melded together into weird multi-human forms. It sounds incredibly horrific, but the Orcs are finding the entire experience very, very funny. Eventually the ship comes crashing back out into real space around a shiny planet, aka a MECHANICUS forge world. Our protagonist for this story is one Uftak Blackhawk, who I think it's fair to say by the end of the story will become a firm favourite of Orc characters in 40k, and he belongs to the Bad Moons clan. Bad Moons are mainly known for their accumulation of wealth and trinkets, and basically getting all the good loot stuff. So when Uftak sees another legendary Orc ship arrive, that of Captain Badrook of the Freebooters, who's He's basically an orc pirate boss leading what are known as Badrock's Flash Gits, who also want to be acquiring tons of loot from the Forge World. In fact, the whole reason they're here is for the overall orc war boss of the Warg, known as the Mech Lord, is setting things up for a very interesting situation where you have a lot of different orcs all attacking the planet. Now, orc clans will sometimes ally towards a common goal, especially when there's a Warg going on, and early on we hear of multiple different orc clans being involved in this attack, and the overarching aim being to get loads of the best loot, and that's pretty much the entire goal. The orcs, of course, plus having some good fights and bashing lots of Umi skulls in. So that's the core thing that's going on. Then we also have the subplots for this tale, which are the Mechanicus tech priests attempting to prevent both the loss of the Forge World and the loss of their knowledge, more importantly, and then also it becomes apparent that there are dark actors at play here within the Imperials, namely a traitor Mechanicus, that is to say a member of the Dark Mechanicum, and even a traitor Astartes, appearing to muddy the waters and make things all the more complicated for the Imperials. All of this is not especially concerning for the orcs, because they're just going to bash the hell out of whatever's in their way. But there are some really great standout subsidiary characters within the narrative. For the orcs, the two most noteworthy are Princess, an orc squig who becomes essentially Uftak's pet, and who I'm fairly sure many an orc Bad Moon player will have already converted a squig to represent, and Princess the squig appears seemingly for no real reason other than wanting perhaps to be near this orc Uftak, and he becomes fairly attached to the stupid flesh ball by the end of his battles here on the Forge World. The absolute best thing about Princess, of course, is that Uftak names the squig once aboard a Titan, and he comically misreads the human language in the control bridge of the Warlord Titan, so instead of Princeps, he reads it as Princess. Another great character on the orc side of things is the Grot Nizquick, who is like many a Gretchen trying to both serve his superior Uftak and simultaneously not get killed for comedy or otherwise. Nizquick, though, is actually a really comical, fun character and is very likeable, albeit also mildly irritating like most Grots are. The main other subplot characters are Zephyr Varas, who is Forge World Hephaestos Lexico Arcanus, and she is a member of the Mechanicus High Council here, whose role it is to interpret the data of the Orcs' offensive and also to protect the data and knowledge of this Mechanicus node. We also have Secutor Hayfax Mitranda, is a figure who will appear later and leads the Forge World's defenders, but another important character. Within the Forge World itself there is this plot regarding also the Chaos Demon, but for me the most interesting part is of the Mechanicus insights laid out for us here, how their logical assessments can be both brutal and cold, but also problematic. Mechanicus sits within the umbrella of the Imperium, but it also operates in a disconnected way, structured by its own design. Ever since the foundation of the Mechanicum of Mars, just like most Imperial worlds, Forge Worlds may have regional specific details. But there's one difference for the Mechanicus, and that is their leadership often has democratic elements to it, where it's governed by a council of members who have a collective opinion on decisions, and the Fabricator General will cast essentially a deciding vote. So Zephyr describes this as much when the Mechanicus council members are debating what they must do to save their world, and she considers how such a schism could paralyze their ability to coordinate the planet's defense. So whilst this is mainly a story about orcs bashing heads, it's also a very good window into the Mechanicus, and that by the nature of their structure, they end up pulling in different directions based on different agendas and the information available, and this actually inhibits their ability to make fast, pertinent decisions despite their advanced means of noosphere communication being more efficient than the unenhanced humans. So given that this is a more battle-focused story, I think I can begin by just discussing the overall narrative, including all the elements. So I've noted we have the Orcs, the Mechanicus, and then a Chaos element within. But overall here, we have the Orcs trying to grab all the good stuff they can, and they're basically smashing hell out of everything and generally being very orky about it. That might sound overtly simplistic, but what did you expect? It's the Orcs, that's basically what they do. So Uftak uses his cunning ways to get the upper hand at several stages in the story, including deceiving Imperials by hiding in captured vehicles. Uftak is also stealing an Orc racer, jumping it up onto an Imperial Titan, and then proceeds to smash through into the head section, the control center, and with the help of his entourage quickly taking over the Titan. In the end, Uftak has to face off against the Orc Flashgit's boss Badrock, and we also see some truly epic Orc use of tech as they teleport a Mega Gargant down to the planet's surface. That's basically teleporting a Titan onto a planet, something which blows the minds of the Mechanicus so much that they almost consider the loss of the planet acceptable if they can just learn how on earth the Orks achieved this. Logic prevails, and they quickly realise this is an unattainable fever dream. So speaking of the Mechanicus, their story is actually not considerably more complex than the Orks, because they're quite simply trying to defend the planet, and when it comes to it, salvage what they can to prevent the Xenos abuse and of course the sacred protection of knowledge. The intrigue for the Mechanicus narrative is in their interactions, and this is such a great and entertaining listen when it comes to the Mechanicus and how they relate to one another, especially when things get heated later on and some of them start making requests of impossible to achieve objectives, to which other Mechanicus are left to reply with exasperation that it cannot be done and saying things like, "Your order is illogical." This is about as aggravated as Mechanicus get, and it's greatly entertaining. Zephyr is a really great character. You have to appreciate her absolute devotion to her duty, to the Omnissiah, and in the beginning she feels like obviously an important member of the Mechanicus Council here on the planet, but she obviously lacks some of the gravitas of the more senior members, or those with roles that deal in more heavy matters like the Dominus and the Fabricator General. But in quite short order, she becomes ever more assertive and aggressive, even with her decisions and the logical assessments of the situation. It all culminates in what I think is probably one of my favourite moments for this story, and I'll talk about that when we're discussing Mechanicus specifically later. Then we have this Chaos subplot, which involves a Dark Mechanicum traitor tech priest, Forge Lord All, and a Chaos Marine of the Iron Warriors, these so-called Warpsmiths. A note, Warpsmiths are basically heretic tech marines. So space marines who have become tech marines will study under the Mechanicus for many years, and in this time they usually will absorb the Mechanicus ideology, and so will have the same respect and relative worship of machine form and technology as the Mechanicus do. Heretic tech marines of the Chaos Astartes similarly would formerly have held these outlooks. However, now, like the Dark Mechanicum, they're twisted and seek to dominate and subjugate technology, twisting it to their own ends, and absolutely placing no limit on how or where they acquire technology, Xenos or otherwise, so long as it can be put to use by themselves. So here on the Forge world of Hephaesto, we discover slowly that one of the tech priests appears to be in fact Dark Mechanicum, and is working on a project that has not been fully hidden from the Mechanicus, but is more hiding in plain sight. By working out in the open, he's essentially saying, well look, I'm not doing anything wrong, this is what I'm working on. And you also get the impression that the Mechanicus are often doing their own projects around the Forge world, and not necessarily too interested in what else is happening. In fact, this actually comes up in the story when Zephyr is trying to escape and she bumps into another Mechanicus who hasn't even really been aware that the planet is under attack, because they're so focused on what they're doing in their own specific area of the Forge world. And also for ourselves, it's not entirely clear initially what Lord Ull is up to, but anybody with a bit of guesswork and the standard 40k suspicionary of suspect everybody is probably leaning in the direction that it's something untoward. We then have the very strange appearance of this Warpsmith of the Iron Warriors here on the Forge world, because he has a very specific grudge to bear, but it's very bizarre how he appears. This planet is apparently the home of a Titan Legion who destroyed a Titan he had some kind of bond or close experience with, and it's his goal via the construction of Forge Lord Ull to then bind a demon to this machine and use it to destroy the loyalist Titans here on the Forge world, and ultimately to destroy the planet itself by disrupting the lava flow STC machinery the Mechanicus use here. These are the main points of the narrative. There are various other small elements going on, like the fact that, like I said, on the Forge world STC tech is being used to control the lava flows, use it for power. This seems something we've seen on other Forge worlds also before, where the Mechanicus are able to use the geological power of a planet to power entire cities, and this seems fairly logical given our thoughts about humanity of the past in the Dark Age of technology, what they may have done and been able to do in order to optimize the use of worlds they found themselves in, where they can get power from, etc. We also get to see the Orks' standard hierarchical structure going on, which is very much belittled by the Imperials as being the biggest Ork commands. And whilst that's not entirely untrue, it's ironic that while the Imperials regularly throughout the events make derogatory comments about the Orks, this actually doesn't end up doing them any good. In fact, actually the opposite. The Mechanicus stagnate themselves with indecision and underestimation of their enemy. Critically though, it becomes clear later that this indecision is perhaps not as organic and unintentional as it may have seemed, and Zephyr has to make a very difficult decision at the end of the story. It sets her up for potentially also future narratives. And this story overall actually sets up very well for the continuation of the main characters, and I personally hope that happens somewhere along the line. Within 40k, there are very much always more stories to be told, as we've seen recently with the Gaunt Ghosts, a beloved series from the community, but one which seemingly didn't start out with any specific grandiose aspirations to become some long-standing embedded narrative series, and I'd very much want to hear more about what happens next for Uftak and also Zephyr, regardless of whether their paths should directly cross again or not. So despite there being other elements to Brutal Kunnin, the orcs really do dominate through the story, and rightly so. I personally felt, as I've said, that their amount of time in the narrative was appropriate, because if there was any more, I think it would have verged into the realm of becoming somewhat stale or tedious. As funny and as blunt as the orcs are, it's not going to be easy to really pull out of them much more than, "Hey boss, there's that big thing over there, come on lads, let's get it." Now I gave a very brief overview about the orc characters already, but I found them to be well defined enough so as to be quite memorable. And within that I put as noted the four main orc characters of Uftak, the smart or cunning one, his hapless companion Mogrot, who is about as thick as a squig but pretty good at fighting. We also pick up Nizquick, a Gretchen gun operator from one of the Speed Freaks vehicles, who ends up surprisingly surviving and being quite useful, and then lastly the legendary Princess, the squig, who also appeared randomly when they were nabbing this speedy truck to power them aboard the human's Titan machine. We'd also of course have Captain Badrock, who's surprisingly incidental but ends up being Uftak's main rival throughout the story, really far more so than any of the Imperials, who seem to be barely a consideration beyond how exactly the orcs are planning on dispatching them. Uftak's story arc is one of colossal achievement from start to finish, and as the title of the book implies, it's through him behaving surprisingly cunning for an orc. It leaves us wondering what the future holds for Uftak, because as orcs go, he's rivaling Ghazghkull for his ability to make carefully laid plans and improvise on the fly. He starts off as your fairly average new knob, and is pretty hyped to be getting on with this warg. He of course wants to do his best for the boss, the Mech Lord, and this series of events are basically Uftak smashing into the Imperial Forge world. He crashes an orc speeder by jumping it onto a Titan. Like I said, he smashes in, kills a crew, essentially downs a Titan, just himself, his companion, a Grot and a Squig, which is about the most orc thing ever. Take that, Marneus Calgar whiners. I'm joking, relax. But it was stupid, I admit. And aboard this Titan, as noted, this is where he comically names his squig after misreading information plates inside the head section of the Titan, but nonetheless takes an Imperial Titan in epic orc style. Uftak then also commandeers some Mechanicus grav transports before keeping their heads down to infiltrate past the defences and guards of the Mechanicus, enabling them to then access these evacuating AdMech transports. In here, one of the mech boys grafts an advanced Astartes suit onto Uftak, giving him some really good shiny armour, before he ends up having to fight Badrock, the captain of the Flash Kit's priority orcs, for the best spoils of the loot, but that's something a little different. Now meanwhile, a Chaos Demon engine has destroyed the orcs' Mega Gargant, and Uftak decides he's not having that, not the Mech Lord's best Gargant. And so he steals Captain Badrock's teleporting device, using it to teleport aboard Badrock's flyer, which Uftak has rationalised must be where the captain had come down from. Successfully doing so, he attacks this demon engine, firing all the weapons, which do absolutely nothing to a demon engine. This is to his immense frustration, and Uftak quickly formulates a much better plan, and one that should be a laugh, at least. He aims the flyer directly at the demon engine and everyone ejects out. Meanwhile, the flyer crashes right into the demon engine, destroying it and causing it to fall into the rivers of magma that the Mechanicus have harnessed for power via this ancient STC technology. The whole army of orcs are just loving this, including the Mech Lord, who is equally impressed and declares that Uftak is a boss lad himself now. The orcs have noticed this demon engine was digging around near the lava flow and decide that they should equally investigate. Maybe there's some good loot going on over there. What they discover is this ancient human tech, and Badrock tricks the Mech Lord and Uftak and teleports away with this tech. The orcs have to quickly escape and the lava flows get out of control with the technology from the STC now being gone, but the Mech Lord is still very happy with the loot Uftak has secured him in the form of many Mechanicus data slates that the orc boffins will be able to decipher and allow the orcs to undoubtedly make some real powerful guns and stuff. As I said, we're going to tool up the Warg fleet, and then we're going to start wrecking worlds so bad that even Gork and Mork themselves are going to sit up and take notice. And of course, they're still plenty unhappy with Captain Badrock. Brutal Kunnin, from the orcs' perspective, is a really good laugh. If there was any criticism for me in this audiobook, it's with the accents of the orcs. Now, I will say that this grew on me over time. By the end of it, it's fine. But I always envisioned orcs as having pretty thick London accents, because this is always how they've been generally represented. And in this tale, the orcs are much more of a solid British Midlands accent. And just FYI, I've got no horse in this race, okay? A large part of my family is from the Midlands in the UK, plus I lived in London for over 10 years, so shut it. But seriously, this is always a bit of a troublesome thing when it comes to audiobooks and characters. If the narrator chooses to voice them in a certain way, it becomes hard to mentally shake that off. But for example, I really struggled with some of the Sororitas audiobooks for this reason. I love the narratives already, but I never had really imagined that all the sisters in kind of close proximity would be having like 6 different accents from all different parts of the UK. It's like, really? In the far, far future, would we have thick British regional accents within the same squads of Sororitas? It really grated on me, and I found it very difficult. But for the orcs here in the beginning, like I say, I found it pretty tough, as it wasn't just kind of how I pictured in my mind. I'd been envisaging them differently forever. However, I will say, like I say, this steadily grew on me, not to mention the fact that I think it's no bad thing that we get a bit of Midlands and Birmingham accents into the orcs here, not just the generic North and South UK London, you know. And by the way, I apologise to those of you from outside the UK who probably stopped listening to me minutes ago, and it raises the question though, doesn't it? I've thought this many times, what do you imagine in terms of accents representing characters in 40k? Could you have an Astartes with an American accent? Would that sit right for people? You know, they always have British voice acting for these kind of things. Would you have an American do that? Could that work? Does that work in people's minds? I don't know. Could work. I mean, there's no, you know, in the future, in the far future, this is really a whole other topic, but it's an interesting one to think about. What sort of voices would people have in M41? I always imagine this to be a very complex issue. Probably should do some research about kind of language and stuff. But it's when you think about thousands, you know, so many millennia into the future, thousands of years of different rich cultural development across the galaxy, languages all mixing and changing. What are those accents going to sound like? I'm pretty sure they probably wouldn't sound like thick British regional accents, but to a degree, you have to suspend your disbelief. You know, we can't just invent people's different voices and stuff. But anyway, that's a whole other thing. Short version, I didn't like the voices too well in the beginning, but then I warmed up to it and it was fine. So by the end of the story, I was very on board with the orcs and the characters. It felt great, even if it did feel sometimes like I was listening to my uncle do an impression of an orc. A couple of other things to note in regard to the orcs, one being something that I always greatly love when it comes to orcs, that being how comically apathetic they are to human suffering. You can imagine them tearing off a human's arm accidentally and then having a good laugh about it. Kind of reminds me in sort of some of the Mad Max films, especially Mad Max 2, where the guy gets his fingers chopped off by the boomerang and everyone's just laughing at him despite the fact he just had his hand, you know, horribly minced. Meanwhile, if the story was being told from the human's point of view, they'd be then crying on the floor in miserable, unending horror. But the orcs, they're just having a good old laugh. In fact, the orcs are often disappointed with the poor effort made by the humans, or that their heads went squish too easily. When told from the orcs' point of view, it basically goes, we came, we smashed them good, and then, what, that's all they got? Stupid Umis. I think at one point when they're fighting aboard the Titan, one of the orcs actually crushes a human skull to the point it bursts like a melon, and he doesn't even notice, and he's like, oh, what the hell, like, all this stuff all over my hand. Throughout the story as well, the orcs generally reference almost any decision made by the Imperials from the context of some kind of fighting. They have additional entry points to the Forge world itself. It's rationalised by the orcs as being so that the Umis can get away if there's a fight, because Umis are weird like that. Why wouldn't they just want to fight? This actually makes me think back to the ancient techno-barbarian character in Valdor Birth of the Imperium, where he describes the ascent of the Emperor's army and how towns suddenly had become crewed with militia to keep the peace. And he found this very strange, and bizarrely it was as if people didn't want to just have random fighting and horror anymore. And this techno-warrior found this very difficult to understand. Why would that be the case? Why wouldn't you want to have good fighting? So this human savage warrior from the Age of Strife is actually quite comparable to the orcs mentally. And I think that's an interesting cross-reference to note how far humanity had fallen during the Age of Strife. They're actually kind of on par with the orcs. I think just generally Brutal Kunnin is good at showing us a nice selection of different orky things, and the power of the orcs, like for example the power to teleport something the size of a Titan down to the planet. Something that is apparently so impossible the Mechanicus can't even believe it, despite actually having witnessed it. I love the description also about Uftak saying Uftak was quite good at counting, and although he got a bit lost above 5, he was rock solid up to that point. I also enjoyed that Uftak would sometimes consult the other orcs around him to help gain perspective, particularly when they're trying to figure out what the Umis are going to do, and then Nizquix the Grot says, well, I'd run away with the loot boss, and Uftak realises the Mechanicus will be trying to leave the planet with all their loot, so his whole plan is actually hinged around this Grot's observation. I also love the interjection of other bits of orc wisdom, like their observation that humans didn't like it if you took their skulls, but then they did weird stuff with them anyway, like they would make them float around and shoot guns. And this seems very apt and actually seems to have a bit more awareness of just how weird humans have become in the 41st millennium than perhaps self-awareness humanity has of itself. But I think that's probably one of the biggest things I take away from Brutal Kunnin. It's a story about orcs, Mechanicus and Chaos vendettas, but it's far more about the observations of these factions and the juxtaposition of how they see one another. Now, the Chaos angle in this story is interesting, but relatively straightforward. Forgelord All, the Heretic and Warpsmith of the Iron Warriors, Dalen, have an arrangement whereby together they'll bring forth a greater demon into the body being created by All, and the pact between the Iron Warrior and demon is that they should destroy the Mechanicus piece of STC technology, and they use this to regulate, like I've said, the lava flows, give them power, etc. Thereby destroying the planet and delivering Dalen's vengeance upon the Loyalists and the Titan Legio, who apparently downed this favoured Titan that he venerated. The interesting part is less the happenings though of All and Dalen. They're fairly pragmatic and nothing too unexpected. The intriguing part, as noted, is in the demon itself and how it has to acclimatise to the material world. This is not something we commonly see described because demons are always seen as being these very ethereal, mysterious, powerful beings who are dominating and so powerful even when they appear in our material realm. And so the impression we get from the demon in this story is that it is actually quite difficult for it to cope with being in the material space. It's quite the fish out of water, and this hinders what it has to do and makes it all the more troubling. Although it's a very ancient, powerful demon, and so it does quite adeptly deal with things eventually. It struggles to understand the technology it's been bound into. It's kind of like a newborn lamb or something. This seems fairly logical, but it's nice to have this highlighted. The demon arrives from the warp into this machinery and is like, what the hell is this? What am I doing? It needs additional knowledge and information from All and Daven to really integrate itself truly and conceptualize how to operate the demon engine. We also get to seeing how binding a demon to physical matter in the materium enables them to essentially become tethered in real space. That is to say, they don't require connection to the energy of the warp any longer to sustain it. Additionally, this makes it harder though to kill, as you not only have to kill the demon, but also its surrounding physical shell. The negatives for the demon is that by being bound to a war engine crafted by mortals, it cannot seemingly leave the machine of its own free will. Once it's bound to that, it's locked until it is destroyed, and then it's free to return again to the warp. So this meant that any damage being inflicted upon the demon war engine is actually physically felt by the demon. This is a sensation the demon is seemingly unfamiliar with and is very unhappy. It's traumatized even by this. Because you might imagine, were you never to have felt true sensations before, suddenly feeling pain, bad pain, would undoubtedly be extremely overwhelming. Now, another noteworthy reference from the demon, and one that you guys know I will love, is in its relation to its perception of time. And don't be scared, I'm not going to go off talking too much about time, but this is something you all know I've given considerable time to thinking about, time in the warp. So within the story we hear from the demon itself considering how it feels being in the warp relative to real space, and this is a useful point of reference for us in confirming what we know about the warp. This is, like I always say, the best way to truly make reasoned judgments on what is and isn't real in 40k. The more corroborating accounts, the more likely we can assume this is the present order of things. Although it should be noted, in a galaxy where the Imperium can suppress through propaganda and subjugation, the thinking of trillions is still perhaps not necessarily fair to say. We can never really know anything with absolute certainty. After all, what is knowing? The demon itself considers the following. It had been eons since it had experienced this realm, since it had tasted the corpses of stars that form the gases of the air. It felt once again the strange, falling sensation of time that passed under its own rules, steady and inexorable. Time that was not subservient to the whim of whatever power controlled the realm in which it existed. That I find to be very specifically interesting. It also says that such pervasive order, such permeating regimentation, was like a splinter in the mind. Almost immediately after this, we get the other thing that's noteworthy for Chaos in this story, and that is of course their relationship to the orcs. The demon repeatedly refers to the orcs as being an abhorrence, it says. The abhorrence, living, thinking beings over which the true powers could hold little influence, resistant to the hated changer, resistant to the grandfather of disease, and resistant to the snares of excess cast by the Dark Prince. Even the blood god, mightiest of the ruinous powers, could not offer them any outlet for their warlike nature that was not provided by their worship of their own brutish gods. The abhorrence proliferated vermin with an infuriating inability to acknowledge the powers of chaos. It talks about how, comparative to the other races of the galaxy like the Eldar and humans, orcs did not appreciate the horrors and powers of chaos, it says. The abhorrence would see only another enemy to fight. Even those amongst them who could bend and shape reality to their will drew their power mainly from the massed, latent, psychic ability of their kin, not from the raging tempest of the warp. It was as though the glory of chaos was simply irrelevant to them. So we can see that chaos absolutely despise the orcs. They're an incredible frustration to them, triggering even, as this demon engine seems absolutely incensed by the orcs. It's almost as if chaos feels quite entitled to the souls and sufferings of mortals, and the fact these green oddballs have the audacity to just throw it all out in the face of chaos is more than they can contend with. For the orcs, we well know they don't care about the offerings of chaos, and when faced with anything more complicated than which orc has got a bigger gun than you, their general answer is probably going to be something Gork or something Mork, or maybe Gork and Mork or Gork and Mork. As noted, they don't even have the good grace to use warp power directly, and thus chaos considers them the abhorrence. So within Brutal Kunnin, it's very entertaining for us to see this side of chaos, this frustration, this kind of petulant child rising to the surface, and the Chaos Demon's so incensed it ends up destroying the Orc's Gargant. And then we come to the Mechanicus. Mechanicus are a strange faction for me, because I always find them captivating and enthralling when it comes to their appearances in the lore and the narratives, the audiobooks, plus their aesthetic is fantastic and so very 40k, yet strangely I have never felt a strong desire to collect them as minis, which is strange because I have quite the collection of minis at this point in time. Anyway, the point is, as per usual, I greatly enjoyed the Mechanicus in this story. Primarily it's focused on, as I said, the High Council Administrator Zephyr and her journey from fairly subdued, I would characterise, more junior member of the Mechanicus, but obviously she's still in the Council of the planet, so she's far from being unimportant or without authority. But in the early discussions between the Mechanicus leaders of the planet, you can tell she doesn't want to stand up too much against the more senior members. Of course, by the end of the story, this dynamic is turned completely upside down, and it's great. Early on, we often see the Mechanicus exclaiming things in disbelief, and you get a real sense of their problematic understanding of the things happening around them. The Mechanicus are heavily rooted in logic, and the Orcs are really the antithesis of this. A lot of things Orcs are capable of make no sense, or they achieve goals that should be far outside their capabilities, even really defying the laws of reality. And this starts right from the outset when the Orcs enter the planet's space aboard this Imperial vessel, and not for the last time the Mechanicus leaders are heard to suggest that such a thing must be impossible, yet at the same time reality is staring them right in the face, and so they're left to try and mentally wrestle with things difficult for them to rationalise. And this is one of the core themes for the Mechanicus in Brutal Kunnin. We see them continually suggesting orders and actions that are very debatably counterproductive or literally impossible. And in the beginning, this appears to simply be a disconnect between the way the Mechanicus logically determine actions versus the illogical nature of the Orcs. Zephyr herself in the beginning seems to rationalise things this way. However, as it goes along, and especially towards the end, Zephyr having revealed the fact that chaos is in play here on the planet, she begins to question further the actions of other Mechanicus earlier, and that maybe their obtuse decision making that has bogged down the reaction times and reasonable choices for their defense forces are perhaps not quite as sincere and well intentioned as they had appeared. The theory side of the Mechanicus defense of the planet is coupled with us seeing how the Mechanicus forces conceptualize their fighting style. They approach things in a far more dispassionate, cold, matter-of-fact way, in the sense that where ordinary humans, and in a larger sense the Imperium, may see self-sacrificial acts as heroism and retreat as cowardice, These acts of martyrdom are seen by the Mechanicus and their Skitarii as being at worst unnecessarily wasteful of life and resources, and at best, if it's truly necessary for a tech priest or Skitarii unit to allow themselves to be destroyed, this is acceptable in as much as it's logical for them to do so within the boundaries of campaign efficiency. Essentially, it's fine for their units to be destroyed where they have to, provided it makes logical sense to do so. They're not going to just throw themselves away in a glorious charge at the enemy just for the sake of it. Beyond this though, it can take us into considering deeper differences between the Imperium and the Mechanicus, and how the Imperium tends to glorify its sacrifices, raising them up and worshipping their sacrifice as being ultimately necessary, but simultaneously something to be celebrated, not horrified by. The Mechanicus, you always feel that whilst they may not care about losses per se, they still abhor such wastage and will do all they can to reasonably minimise unnecessary losses, because why wouldn't you do that? You don't want to be just throwing stuff away. That's what the Imperial Guard do. And so when you see the Imperial Guard and the Astartes deployed at the behest of the Imperium, rarely do you see their goals in any kind of ambiguous way. Nearly always they're very clearly defined, justifiable, objective, driven conflicts in the name of the righteous Imperium. The soldiers of humanity are forced to obey martyrous, dismal extremes of material militaristic force, commonly led by seniors ignorant to the scale of the horrifying and commonly illogical forces they're facing. So this is the disparity for me between the different perspectives of the Imperium and the Mechanicus. They're quite stark. And whilst I was thinking about this today, I've often considered how the Imperium's approach to war is well summarised through Terrence Malick's film The Thin Red Line. Now, this is a film that's very conceptual in nature and seeks to explore understanding of inhumanity and war through the study of various characters' existentialist experiences. Now, I risk going off on a super wild tangent here, but stay with me, I'll try to keep it brief, because the whole reason I've raised this film as a reference is because, as anybody who has spent any time thinking on it will know, it gets into some pretty heavy issues around the human condition. If you've not seen it, don't worry, it doesn't matter. I can simply summarise by saying that it most notably addresses an idea of framing humanity and war against and within the context of nature itself, that mankind's warring nature exists as part of the conflict we see in the natural world, one and the same, but specifically within that idea is most importantly the sense of indifference to the brutality and horror and ultimate pointlessness in war. I think, for example, one scene, there's some soldiers running down a river and they're all shooting each other, and it's quite traumatic, and it just cuts away to bats hanging from a tree who are just kind of watching. They don't give a shit because they're bats, and it's about that indifference, about things happening and just carrying on around despite the horror that's happening. It's this indifference and it all being part of the same context. Anyway, there are many references to this throughout the film, both in the characters, the actions, the dialogue, narration, visual symbolism. And this speaks to the idea that no aspect of war is more significant, glorious, or worthy of our attention than any of the other conflicts that we see in nature, and the deliberately unspecific way in which the two sides fighting, the way that they're illustrated, it reinforces that because it's very kind of vague and not too specific. There's considerably more I could get into on this topic, and maybe we'll revisit it when I discuss the Imperial Guard more. But for today I wanted to note that the film's overall themes of indifference towards life and a sense of struggle and conflict to survive, what it's doing is opens up the question, what is this war in the heart of nature? So why are you doing this to us again, LUETIN, with your random off-topic tangents? One, I know most of you like it. I know, and I apologise. But this came to my mind when I was thinking about this core difference between the Mechanicus and the rest of the Imperium. I feel it's a reasonable reference, right, against the nature of humanity and the Imperium for the life of humans in M41, that being of gross indifference and existential questioning set against such a vast empire where the life of one individual means nothing at all, yet it can also mean everything. Think about the end of the story of Colonel Bain, how he struggled, fought within this horrific conflict, and the Imperium just obliterates them, airstrikes, orbital strikes them, destroys them. So that's this kind of existential indifference about the meaninglessness of it all. On the opposite side of things, the Mechanicus value knowledge, the survival of knowledge above all. And what that means is you can't just necessarily throw tons of people away and slaughter everything. Yes, the Mechanicus have the Skitarii, the AdMech forces, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to just throw them into the meat grinder like they do the Imperial Guard, because it's about a more considered approach to what they're doing. And when it comes to knowledge, we see Zephyr reminding them about this consistently, that the most critical thing is the saving of the knowledge. Herself and another character who appears later, Secutor Mitranda, who is the commander of the Skitarii forces, displays the qualities of the Mechanicus most proficiently: clear-minded, logical assessment and execution. And we see in the Mechanicus comparative to the rest of humanity where mankind can very easily get dragged into philosophical considerations about existence, the meaning of the individual weighed against the sacrifice of the collective, what it all means, this sense of individualistic glory that humans espouse, the value is basically of one. These are the major differences between ordinary humanity, even the Astartes, versus the Mechanicus, that sense of humanity, that sense of individualism. And I think it's important within the context of the 40k narrative to grasp that fully. Another relative thing to this is that the Mechanicus are connected via the noosphere. We see this throughout the story and in other stories, and how they communicate with one another and share information. They're functioning not on the individual level, but as a shared collective. And this also informs their approach to combat warfare and how to use their forces. Now I should note Zephyr even has to be careful several times about how she's thinking and using the noosphere, drawing this line between the personal and the shared collective. Also, as I'm sure people will ask questions, the specifics related to the noosphere, they're not especially well documented, okay? It usually is described in a fairly localized fashion, so the noosphere is not something that is, say, what you might think of as like a galactic internet for the Mechanicus. That's not what it is. It's more like all tech priests on a Forge world having Bluetooth connections wherever they go and sharing all information from sensory systems fed into their minds, including all conversations and seemingly sometimes some thoughts there as well. So this is perhaps why you will often see Mechanicus speech saying things like interrogative and clarification, because they're talking in the noosphere, they're not talking verbally. So on one level it's quite Mechanicus to just speak that way in the raw data, saying interrogative. It's a Mechanicus style, but moreover I think it's to aid the context for them when they're discussing within the noosphere to help clarify what they're doing. But my main point is that the Mechanicus are far more disconnected from humanity than I think sometimes people are aware, and it's important to realise that just generally. They despise the weakness of the flesh and the irrational emotion of human decisions. Some of the Mechanicus will go through multiple bodies, live for many thousands of years, looking at you, Belisarius, Call, all of which is of course in service of the goal to secure and protect knowledge. That's why they view the flesh as being weak, because if your body dies, if your brain dies, all the knowledge you learned in your life is lost. And they see the loss of knowledge as being the worst possible thing, basically. If you think about the Dark Age of technology, the Age of Strife, the loss of humanity's knowledge, this is the thing they see as being the most damaging to humanity. And everything they do should be, in theory, decided on the basis also of logical, critical thought. Mostly, this is how they will approach things, but as we see in Brutal Kunnin, not always. Some might remember also we saw Forge Worlds during the Heresy, who by all reason should have joined the traitors, but did not because they had assessed the facts and determined that the Emperor's loyalists would win the day. This cold calculating nature for the Mechanicus can be uncomfortable for humans who place far more of an emotional weight on decisions, especially when it comes to having a sense of loyalty and honour. So it raises the question, if a Forge world remained loyalist only because it had made the assessment that that side would come out victorious, does that apathetic disconnect and cold calculation in and of itself make them untrustworthy and perhaps even heretical? Some in the Imperium would likely say yes. However, they do not get to make that decision because the Mechanicus is the Mechanicus. They operate at varying degrees of independence from Imperial rule. Now Zephyr throughout the story has to contend with many difficult decisions when it comes to this process of data assessment. This originates within her frustration initially at seeing the consistently disordered debates between the Mechanicus Council on how they should defend against the ORKS, and after it becomes clear they're crumbling under the weight of Xenos, she makes the powerful case that they must evacuate as much tech and preserve the data of the Mechanicus node here as much as possible. And so they will begin loading transports that it's determined can likely slip away unnoticed from the planet due to the Orcs' focus on finding the loot here on the planet. Zephyr has to fight the Warpsmith multiple times in the story, and she only survives the final encounter thanks to the Skitarii commander Mitranda, who finally helps her in slaughtering the Iron Warrior. However, by this point Zephyr is all but convinced that the other senior Mechanicus are at best displaying signs of techno-heresy, and she connects the dots that Forge Lord All's creation of the Demon Engine could not possibly have taken place without it being absolutely clear what its intention was, coupled with their ignorant stagnating decisions in defending the world, and finally when she meets up with the fabricated General and Dominus to evacuate the world together, we get a frantic scene whereby the senior members command Mitranda to save some of the transports already lost to Uftak and Badruk, who are arguing over who has the rights to the loot on the transports. Mitranda, the Skitarii commander, is explaining to them that this is impossible. There's no possible way they can achieve this. And to even try is totally illogical. And this is my favourite part. Zephyr decides there and then that this is yet more stalling and that the two senior members are traitors, trying to delay their escape. Zephyr fires at the senior Mechanicus point blank while screaming and leaves them to be slaughtered by Uftak and Badruk, who make a game of seeing who can kill their Mechanicus leader first, agreeing that this competition will help them decide who gets the best loot. The remaining evacuated senior Mechanicus debate the end of the situation briefly, but it takes them no time to see the logic that Zephyr, as the last standing senior Mechanicus, also having saved much of the knowledge of the planet and revealed the heretics, should take on the responsibility as the new Fabricator General. Now, Brutal Kunnin is not a significantly complex story, but then this is because it really doesn't need to be. As I said in the beginning, some 40k stories get heavily into the overarching narratives to do with the Emperor, things like the Cabal and whatnot, subtle cross-sections of Astartes psychology or Imperial intrigue. Others illustrate for us bizarre mysteries and the horrors of the far future, and some like Brutal Kunnin show that you can have a fantastic smashy time and not have it become tedious, which for a narrative that could be summarised as Orcs attack planet and win is quite laudable in my opinion, and I sincerely mean that. I have both listened to and read some of the Space Marine Battle series, and they vary wildly between being attention grabbing and immersive to be absolutely tedious. And this is because descriptively presenting battles is not an easy thing to do, because I think, as I've said, achieving that dynamic feeling of action in a word-only format, or obviously the script for audiobooks, it gives you a feeling of pace, momentum, it has you hanging on for the eventual result. Trying to achieve that, it's not easy. Not at all. And I think this is one of the things for 40k in general, is that there's obviously a lot of fighting. And sometimes I really do skim it, because yes, bolters, chainswords, we got it. Okay, it's all very dramatic, fine. So there needs to be a bit more to it than just that. Overall, I think, and this is another reason why, when you have too much of Space Marines, it can be too much of a good thing. In Brutal Kunnin, there are obviously Orc battles which will stand out. In my mind though, one of the best is Zephyr's first fight with the Warpsmith, where you think that she's going to get obviously absolutely smashed, but then you realise no, she's a high up member of the Mechanicus and is significantly enhanced, especially with her mecha tendrils and so on and so on. And so to the great surprise of the Iron Warrior, she ends up coming out of it well. It's an exciting combat situation in, I imagine, this very claustrophobic space for one-on-one battle, with all their tendrils all slashing around and able to like lock their feet to the floor for balance and so on and so on. It's really well described, and you're really well able to visually illustrate it in your mind as you're listening. The other battle that really stands out in my mind is, of course, Uftak taking down the Titan, because it's such a dynamic and weird situation and just comical as it should be for orcs at every step. The absolute hilarious juxtaposition of an Imperial warlord Titan being bested by a couple of boys, and then the horrifying disrespect of its crew, who we'd actually previously seen this Titan crew, we'd had some insight, it all felt very prim, very proper, very imperial, high respect for the Titan and all this kind of stuff. And we're going to take care of this Xenos rabble and all that. Not too long after this, the crew are having their faces smashed in and a fat squig is just chomping through the remains. It's glorious. The Chaos Demon engine also is a standout fight because of the snapshot insight we get to how a demon feels when it's within the demon engine, like I talked about. We perhaps imagine demons to be unfeeling and immune to the senses of our material world, and through this fight you see that no, this is not the case, and that it's even quite the shock for the demon itself, despite how old it's supposed to be. And it doesn't like it. It doesn't like it at all. So this demon is intriguing throughout the story in its descriptions, which is great for us, because otherwise it would be much more of a flat entity and not really doing much for the overall narrative. But we do get some nice little glints of insight into chaos and the demons. My biggest takeaway from Brutal Kunnin is that this is a story that, yes, is not exclusively about the orcs, which I know I've seen some people say that this catches them off guard, and some people were not even especially a fan of that. However, I feel that there is a very important reason for having the Mechanicus within this story, and that is they very obviously act as a perfect contrast to the orcs. The juxtaposition could not be more stark. The exacting logical human text stacked against the absolutely instinct-driven rampaging warg of the orc. And I wanted to say illogical, but actually throughout this we see that Uftak is far from illogical. He's actually quite reasoned in his thinking, albeit usually fairly simple, but then it doesn't need to be complex. By contrast, the Mechanicus have a range of very complex assessments to make, and this is very much detrimental to their successful evacuation of the planet. The main conclusion I hope people are able to see in this narrative is that while the Mechanicus element and the Chaos subplots are interesting, what you get here is a really solid light shone on just why the Orks are the unsung good guys of 40k. They're all about just living life and loving it. Setting each other up for a fall, it's usually all in good fun. Basically, it's Ork bants. And this couldn't be more emphasised by the end of the story, when Badruk, having had Uftak smash his plane into the Chaos Demon, thus destroying Badruk's prized aircraft, he ends up laughing it off as being hilarious. Much to the surprise of Uftak, who is really confused. And if you needed any additional proof that the Orks are one of the best factions, we should remember that the Chaos Demon ranted multiple times about the Orks being an abhorrence. And Chaos hate the Orks because, like we said, unlike most other species, they can't be manipulated because they either don't care or because Gork and Mork gives them all they need. They don't even use the warp the same way as other races, so they don't fall foul of all the other pitfalls that the mortal races have to contend with. On the Mechanicus side of things, as noted, Zephyr is a great character, and the main aspect I enjoyed was the interaction back and forth between other Mechanicus. Because, as I noted, their ever-increasing exasperation throughout is hilarious, especially when eventually it reaches boiling point when Zephyr loses control and shoots the senior Mechanicus members as they're trying to leave the planet, whilst screaming, "You are heretics! Your conspiracies doomed this planet, now you suffer the consequences!" She's at like her wit's end by the end of the story, and she's just a complete mess and just shoots them and leaves them to die. This is such a great moment, and I really enjoyed the story arc of Zephyr. There's one thing I've omitted overall mentioning, and that is this mysterious Xenos artifact that Zephyr has somehow acquired. The reason being, it's not especially well explained to its purpose or design. But essentially Zephyr, she's acquired this curious artifact, and Dalen, the Warpsmith, when encountering Zephyr in her quarters, discusses this artifact with her. It's unclear as to its purpose. It is though described how Zephyr originally believed this to be an ancient human tech from the Dark Age of technology, but the Chaos Marine reveals that no, it is in fact very obviously Xenos. This leaves Zephyr actually questioning her own judgment, so she wonders whether she's been kidding herself, and the purpose being that she was just intrigued by it and didn't want to have to get rid of it. She also ensures that her own personal belongings are loaded aboard the transports and they are to depart safely along with her. Mainly she's wanting to keep hold of this artifact. Although we don't find out specifically what this item is, we know that by the end of the story that it remains in her possession and has been loaded aboard, and it comes up again and again within the story, so it seems relevant and important because they bring it up again and again. The interesting aspect in this item is that it calls into question the objectivity of Zephyr. I've said plenty about the Mechanicus making these logical decisions, and the fact that Zephyr based her declaration of heresy against the other council members to be based on their decisions, as she says, dooming the planet. However, the Warpsmith explains how he had felt drawn to this item, that it spoke to him, and this appears to catch Zephyr off guard. In the final section of Zephyr's story, she remains in possession of the artifact, but it leaves us wondering, was she right to execute the Mechanicus Council, or was she perhaps the cause of this all along? It doesn't seem likely. It seems likely that she was correct given the context and all of the situation as it's unfolded, but this item remains a question mark, and it wonders whether we're ever going to find out what it is or whether it's going to be an important thing later along. Overall, Brutal Kunnin is just what an Orc story should be. A lot of smashing, some good humour along the way. The juxtaposition against the Mechanicus helps to set it off, and hopefully everyone who got involved with this audiobook recommend will have enjoyed it as much as me. It's not a complex story in the grand scheme of things, but its characters really come through strongly and let it shine, and I would and will gladly listen to it again. Now, I will have the next recommend coming up for you guys for the next audiobook soon, and don't worry, I know we're halfway through the month, but the next one I choose is going to be a short one, but it's also going to be a very important one. But before we finish this video, I want to give you guys your opportunity for community input, and like I say, I will be doing this on every video for any audiobook series that we do going forward. So like I said, lastly, this series is meant to be part of my reformat of the audiobook club, and so whenever we do one of these overviews, I'll reach out to the community section of the channel and include a few of the best comments made there. These can be critical, questioning, or praising. The main point is for them to be just well-made thoughts. So first up, Howard Lott, who said, I really thought it was clever how they balanced the simplicity of the orcs against the complexity of the AdMech. The story never hung on any perspective long enough for it to begin to drag, and each change helped refresh the story, all without sacrificing pace. I found myself rooting for the characters on either side, even within smaller conflicts in the overall war. I'd also like to point out that Uftak's plan with the shop jump dragster was to ramp jump it up, which is the most orky thing I can possibly imagine, and I completely understand orcs cheering for that because I would want to cheer too. Yeah, totally agree. Tomo says, having listened to the Xenos collection, I was very excited to get my teeth into another orc story with brutal Kunnin. I was a big fan of the juxtaposition, like I was saying, between the orcs' general haphazard approach to attacking the world and the cold, serious, methodical actions of the Mechanicus trying to defend it. Fun characters, good story. My sole criticism would be that the ending seemed pretty abrupt, that's true. The writers seemed eager to tie up all the loose ends at once and call it a day in a very short space. Although, I'd still recommend it to anybody who's a fan of orky antics and Mechanicus content. Brioche Panda says, silliness aside, I do think the story does a great job of showing just how brutally literal and practical the orcs can be when directed by the right lads, as it were. That and Uftak's Forrest Gump-esque musings on the universe keep portraying that literal practicality, like how stick bombs negate cover because they curve, or how titans have their heads down between their shoulders because if it looks more humy, it'd probably just get shot and fall over. Personally, I really liked Secutor Mitranda as a character. The fact they represented a more pragmatic military side, like I was talking about the military differences between the Imperial, that's not often seen in the usual tech priests, and it's a nice departure from the norm. That, and you get a big kudos in my eyes when you kill anyone by overhand throwing a powered halberd into a guy because it's simply the most viable option given the circumstances. What they're talking about there is when Zephyr and Mitranda finally killed the Chaos Warpsmith. Every movie ever says one of the more interesting themes of the book is unintended consequences. Throughout the book, characters' actions result in catastrophic damage which they did not mean to intend. One great example is near the end of the book. The creation of the Demon Engine was an unintended consequence of the Forge Lord trying to save the planet. Poltergeist very simply says, this book was fun for another Xenos and was a good balance of seriousness with orc silliness. Didn't treat the reader like they knew nothing. If I had one complaint, it would be that there wasn't enough crumping. It's always fair to say, isn't it? Zach Bahonos says, this is literally the third official piece of Games Workshop content I've completed. Kinda new, so if I'm jumping to conclusions, please take what I say with a grain or two of salt. And I want to include this because it's always good to have new people coming in, and often people are usually right on the money. I was pretty blown away when it occurred to the Grand Arcanist that she might be the only member of her council that has not been corrupted by chaos. I guess I'd always thought of the cult Mechanicus as being too entrenched within their work to really have the notion of straying from knowledge in the machine god. But with someone like the Dominus or anyone else in the council, it was cool to see how easily their leadership could be swayed by agents of chaos, or in this case the Warp Forge Master. I'm curious if there's any other examples of corruption within the cult Mechanicus, and if so, were they as disastrous? I mean, a demon the size of a titan seems kind of a big oh fuck moment. In my opinion, the agents of chaos walked away the real winners. They were able to experiment successfully with forging demons with the Mechanicus technology. They did all get killed though, and as a result pretty much guaranteed the loss of the Forge World. This is true. Maybe the cult could have held the boys back, but with a complete lack of leadership, I think the Forge World really stood little chance. My favourite scene was definitely when the Orc speed car got ported into the Titan. Yeah, everybody loves this. Like the rest of the boys, I wasn't really sure what happened, but man, it was cool. And lastly, a couple of short little comments here. Uncle says, I think my favourite character was Captain Badrock. Just the way the voice work was done for him really brought out a pirate orkiness. And Mikhail says, I'd never expected the rock, paper, scissors game of 40k to include Squig Princeps. This is probably my favourite part of the book. Exactly. So guys, that was Brutal Kunnin. That was my overview and assessment of the audiobook. Thank you much indeed for watching. Hope you enjoyed. I'll be back soon with very much more. Like I said, it's been a heavy couple of weeks for me, but I've got some new stuff coming up really soon that I know you're going to enjoy. So, more stuff on the way. Thanks for watching. Enjoy, drop a like, and I will have the next recommend coming for you very soon as part of another video. So as always, I will see you guys in the next one.